Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your singing, dancing, stocking-wearing host, Scott Weatherly. And as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, straight from Transylvania.
Yeah, this is a good choice this week. We are going to be doing the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Now, this is two weeks in a row. We did, a sort of. I'm going to be careful using the word camp because I know it holds sort of like, other connotations. But the camp classic Barbarella, the 60s sort of sex kitten type thing, jumping forward sort of like 10 years, it's the same sort of like we're doing another camp classic, but in a very, very different vein, really, in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. But this is one of your choices. I think so. You said that this is quite close to your heart and stuff, really. So, when did you come across this, then, Julian? What are your roots with this film?
Well, I love this film so amazingly. I discovered it when I was a teenager, and a bit of backstory. I grew up sort of all across the country, and I had been living outside of LA until like third grade, and then my parents moved to rural Illinois. So I went from, Pasadena to a town where literally my block ended in a cornfield. So, I was in a very different milieu. And, it was a much more repressive one. It was, behind the times. Mm-hmm. And, in my high school, there was one openly gay kid. He had been a friend of mine, and I was the only one who stayed friends with him. And I remember talking to him, before school would start, and the rest of the class would, just be staring at us, and, they'd think, Julian's probably gay if he's hanging out with Dave there. And, I'd just be like, okay, you think what you want to think. Mm-hmm. But I was, beaten up for walking differently. And, they made it pretty clear that it was for having an effeminate walk. And, they sort of implied that it was because they thought I was gay. So, that was the climate in which I grew up, in purgatory in the Midwest. And Rocky, my sort of like alternative indie friends who, played guitar and listened to Dead Milkmen and, stuff like that, got me into Rocky. And we started going to these midnight shows, and here was a totally different world. Mm-hmm. Here was, and rewatching it, the way in which Frankenfurter, first of all, not only, Tim Curry is so wonderful.
Oh, he is awesome in this.
But, it's clear that even though he tyrannizes these minions around him, they find him attractive. He's alluring. He is so unapologetic in his sexuality. And the fact that this was celebrated was so opening and so liberating. And even though, I didn't end up identifying as gay, I still found myself incredibly liberated by this freedom and this presentation. And it let me be a lot more comfortable, not only with my sexuality, with all the odds and ends that all of us have, mm-hmm. but also, liking fashion, or, it's okay to like these girly things or these things that are coded that way. So it certainly is incredibly dear to my heart for those reasons. What about you?
No, weirdly, we sort of talked about this off air a little bit, last week. Sort of, I didn't watch this film until later in life. It's one of those that sort of like about. It's sort of. I knew it as you said, the midnight showings. The sort of I knew that there were these events and stuff. And I remember when I was at uni in the early 2000s. Like that was, there was a thing that I know people that went to them, in fancy dress, and there was the whole singing along and stuff. And it sounded awesome. And that's when I first sort of saw it. And at the time, I was saying, like, it was fun, but it never really sort of like struck that major chord with me. Like it wasn't that sort of like, ooh, I think I was into other things at the time. It's like, oh, it's a cool film, and that was it. And so I've sort of seen it a couple of times since, but I've always seen it in that vein of a musical. Now the reason for that though is because the song "The Time Warp," I have known that song before I've known this film. That song is just a part of British culture in the same way that songs like the Okie Kokie or these other like baffling songs that become like just standard party songs. So this is what's like, let me put it this way. I have heard this song played at kids' birthday parties from the age of like 3 onwards. Like I've known this at like kids' birthday parties, at weddings, at christenings, at all these different things where, this song comes on, you hear that dun, 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 dun from the beginning, and everyone goes, oh, I love this song, and everyone races to the dance floor and does the sort of the motions of put your hands on your hips and really gets into it. And then you watch the film and you think, I don't think many people know where this comes from.
There's all these Tories going, it's just a jump to the left, and then they go vote anti-gay.
Well, that's the thing. I've known old women like grannies and stuff going, I love it. This song is so much fun, and that's where this sort of song has come from for me. And then to know it, there's a version of this song which I think was released as a single, which is very, very the compilation is a bit different to what's in the film. But then you see it in the film, and it's just so. All the music in this film is amazing. It's only really in the last couple of watches, and I watched it the other night. Alex and I both watched it actually, and I was just like, actually, this film is a joy. Like there's an energy to this film that is just incredible. And having watched it this time, I think when everything's over and we're all back to sort of being able to go to the cinema and stuff, I'm going to find a midnight showing of this, and I'm going to go. Because I can imagine it just watching it was fun. Watching this with people must be incredible.
Yeah. Well, when I was a teenager, they had published, I forget if it was like Now or one of those indie comics publishers did like a 3-issue adaptation, and it had in the back of it. Yes. No, I'm not. It was black and white, and we had those comics. And we got together, and in the back of those comics was the audience participation. And so we just sat there memorizing, having never, I don't, maybe we had been to one show or something, but we just sit there day after day after day memorizing this stuff. And then we'd make up our own that like only we knew, and then we'd go. And, so we did that a lot. And then I went to Hawaii and saw it in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, I'm like the only one yelling out certain lines that are from the Midwest, and they have lines that I'm like, what is that? I've never heard that. And I've seen it since, and it kind of continues to grow and evolve. And, there are lines that I still remember that like were made up in a room with us that I've heard other people say just because it catches on and nobody knows where it comes from, and it's different wherever you go. So, yeah, I mean, we sat there and memorized all that stuff.
Well, it is. It's a phenomenon, but like it's there's like there's a list of like the top cult films, aren't there? They're films that sort of like the mainstream may have heard of, but there's a real passion and drive for these films elsewhere, and this has got to be up there for those sorts of things. But this, I have to admit, this was probably the first time, because I'm doing it for the show, that I've really focused in on like plot and some of the characterizations and stuff that I'd left. I just because you get carried away by it all. And there were several points where I was like, I'd never noticed that before. That sort of I want to bring up in a bit. But yeah, it's just it is. I can see why this is a phenomenon. And I will say the final thing before I give a quick of the plot and the details is before I watched this, Tim Curry to me was a very he obviously is the clown from It, and also Clue. The 19. I love that film. That's an incredible. And I also am from like things like Home Alone 2. So to me, Tim Curry is that. And then to watch this and you think like, how is he not a bigger star? Because this performance is like his comedy timing, his singing, his sort of like just overall performance is phenomenal. Did he ever do this on stage?
Yeah, he did this on stage before it was turned into a film.
Oh,
so in London, that was Tim Curry. But yeah, he was kind of reluctant to revisit it. He didn't want to do a sequel. And then when they did that live broadcast, like in 2016, he played the criminologist, since he was older.
Yeah.
I think Tim Curry is funny because everybody who knows Tim Curry loves Tim Curry, but we all like Tim Curry from different movies. It's funny you mentioned Home Alone too. I have a friend who, is maybe 26, and she says, I love Home Alone too. Tim Curry will always be that for me. And for me, Tim Curry will always be Clue.
Yeah.
And this, both of which I know all of the lines to, and I mean, I can hear the timing of every single line in Clue in my head. And each line, just the timing feels perfect. And I feel that way with Rocky as well.
Yeah. It's Clue is something I may have to visit on our sister podcast, 20th Century Geek, because that's one of those films that, it's almost like a lost movie. Like, it doesn't get talked about anymore. I don't think you can get many copies of it, but they did amazing things with that film. But his performance is great overall. But a couple of details. So Rocky Horror Picture Show released in 1975, directed by Jim Sharman, written by Richard O'Brien and Jim Sharman, starring Tim Curry, as you say, Susan Sarandon, Barry Bostwick, Richard O'Brien, and Patricia Quinn. So I've just kept the top sort of main. There's loads more. I mean, I love the fact that Meatloaf makes a real, like, insane cameo in this, and but the plot is a young couple, Janet and Cross. What's his name already? What's his name?
Brad Majors and Janet Weiss.
That's it. Young couple are attending a wedding at the beginning, and Brad decides to propose, and having declared his love for her, they decide they're going to go visit the teacher or the professor whose class they were in when they fell in love, and they drive off. And in doing so, they go into it's a stormy night. The car breaks down, and looking for a phone, they come across a gothic-looking house populated by Dr. Frankenfurter, his minions, which we'll come on to what they are, and his sort of creation, Rocky. And it is a liberating and bizarre experience from there. So yeah, just to go through the plot list from the start, this is the first time that two things jumped out at me. At the wedding, Tim Curry plays the priest, and also Richard O'Brien and Patricia Quinn are his two sort of like helpers. But more than that, they are playing the American Gothic from the painting.
And they're in the background also in the mansion.
Yes.
And it's like, is this some weird like alter ego thing?
Like, weirdly, that's the thing, because I'd read that happening and I paid attention to it this time. But more than that, when it jumps to the criminologist, who is played by Charles Gray, who I also know as Blofeld, so just that it's a really bizarre sort of crossover. But the first thing he has over his shoulder is a picture of the wedding with a red circle around Tim Curry with an arrow to it. So even the film's telling you that's something. And so I was a bit like, is that supposed to be a clue? Like, is it something? And it just moves on and sort of leaves it. But it's fascinating. It really does sort of like mind twist from the very beginning. And
I don't know that there's an answer to that. I mean, having kind of grown up with it, I mean, it is to me like a little Wizard of Oz, right? Like, I've gone into this other world through the tornado and they're analogs. It kind of evokes that, but obviously we're supposed to think this mansion is real, right? So
yes,
I don't know.
There is definitely like two worlds, even in. We'll get to it, because there are definitely like two worlds, because you find out the professor that they're going to visit, not only has he been their science professor at college or whatever, he actually appears to be in some sort of like battle or like ongoing conflict with Frankenfurter and these invading aliens. It's just weird.
It seems like, yeah, no, I know that's very weird. So, I mean, just to flesh out that plot, the Meatloaf, plays Eddie, who has been put on ice, and you kind of find out slowly that Frankenfurter was sort of had a relationship with Columbia, one of the two female minions, and then sort of dropped her and got involved with Eddie, who's kind of a 1950s sort of like from Greece, a kind of rock and roller on a motorbike, and then got tired of him, put him in like sort of cryogenic freeze, and built this Frankenstein monster, who doesn't look like a Frankenstein monster, looks like a Charles Atlas, and in fact, the reference is clear. That's all in that song. And then, so he kills Eddie. Eddie is revived. He kills Eddie. Susan Sarandon, Brad Majors and Janet Weiss are sort of seduced. They sort of like turn to the dark side, and, Brad has gay sex with Frankenfurter. Susan Sarandon is, screwing Rocky. It's all gone pretty crazy. And finally, Dr. Scott shows up, and he says, there's this whole thing where Frankenfurter says, oh, don't tell me this is a coincidence. You happen to come here, and, Dr. Scott, who works for the CIA investigating UFOs. Yeah. And it's like, no, it's just a coincidence in this movie.
Yeah, it is a bizarre plot. I mean, that's the thing. Well, one of the things, again, like focusing on this, the more I learn about the plot, because there's little details, like I say, Eddie was clearly, I don't know if he was supposed to be dead or knocked out, because he has like a big gash on the front of his forehead when he comes through the ice.
Well, you find out later, and I guess this was a little clearer in the stage production, but you find out later that Frankenfurter took half of his brain and used it for Rocky.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, Sorry.
No, it's good. It's a little thing, but it's the thing that throughout this, the one thing I've sort of found later on is I think of Frankenfurter, because I think Frankenfurter is a fascinating character, because you say he is tyrannical, like he's a narcissist, like there's no doubt, like the guy is a narcissist because it's all about him. He makes it all about him throughout, and he's a total hypocrite because he's obviously out to enjoy himself. Because there's a great line he sort of says, a good time should not be this hard. Basically, sort of suggesting it's all the stuff he's having to do. But he sort of seduces Brad and Janet, and you've obviously got the history with Eddie and Columbia, and then obviously he's made Rocky. But he's obviously all about this idea of just enjoy it, just go with the flow, do this thing, because that's how he sort of seduces Brad. I like the fact he dresses up as the partner, so when he goes into Janet, he's obviously like got a Brad disguise on, and when he goes into Brad, he's got a Janet disguise on. So it's done brilliantly. But the moment he notices that Rocky is sharing some sort of relationship with Janet, like he goes mad. Like it's a real box of like, oh no, I can go out and enjoy as much things as I like, but no, you don't get to do that. So yeah, there is sort of like he's a really interesting. I can see why the two Richard O'Brien, Patricia Quinn sort of characters, why they eventually just get tired of him at the end. They're like, right, we're going home. Like we've had enough of this. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that as a character?
It's not easy having a good time.
That's it. Yeah.
One of my favorite lines. Yeah, I mean, I did think, especially this time through. I mean, I have to confess, whenever I think about this movie, I mean, there are songs that I like more than others. I think the whole thing with Eddie the whole thing with Rocky reviving, Rocky being created goes on way too long. That sort of Damocles number I'm not fond of. And then Eddie, I've never liked Eddie. I mean, I want to kill Eddie. Eddie is stupid. He's a punk, and I like the punk kind of motorcycle thing, but and I know Richard O'Brien wanted this, but he's such a kind of like love letter to the 1950s and to sort of 1950s counterculture. And that means nothing to me and never will. So, and I also like he's introduced and then murdered at the end of his introductory song. And, I like that they eat him, right? There's a great bit where he served the sort of Thyestes feast style to the crowd. But so I mean, I think that for my money, the heart of the film is really twofold. I mean, it's really Brad and Janet starting off. The first shot is a cross. They're getting married, and it's all prim and proper. They're both virgins. Their seduction and how easily they give way to this wonderfully seductive Brad clearly enjoying having his neck kissed by Frankenfurter, and like, just as long as you won't tell, right? I mean, the way in which they're so easily seduced, the hypocrisy of that kind of puritanism, and then destroyed by the end. And then the second plot is sort of the whole Frankenfurter and this tyrannical sort of thing that he set up that you're talking about. And this time through, it really occurred to me, like, I mean, I think this is a wonderfully fun movie, but it's also a really sad movie. And as a depressive, like, that speaks to me, and as somebody who has embraced, hedonism as a kind of, for good and for ill, as a kind of like medication for depression and for how horrible this world is, this speaks to me a lot. And I think Frankenfurter, like, this time through, especially, the Time Warp is a protest song. It is them saying, like, we miss transsexual and the galaxy of Transylvania, right? You've stranded us here, like, you're busy making Rocky and, having great sex with all of these people. And, we're dancing and celebrating, but they're celebrating how they want to, they're singing about how they want to return home. And, that kind of tyranny of, he outright murders Eddie, and it's just like, well, it was a mercy killing, and everybody just kind of like, they're scared shitless of this guy.
Yeah, no, and that, I mean, the thing I like about that is the fact that there are these things, these elements that, like, they just don't explain stuff, and I kind of like that in some films. So you're just sort of thrown into the craziness. Like, you are Brad and Janet, like that scene where they go in and sort of they're met by Richard O'Brien. And he plays like, I mean, like you said, this film is a love letter to so many different things. Like, he is Igor and all this other stuff. And even when they're Patricia Quinn, when they've got their alien costume on, like, she's got the Bride of Frankenstein hairdo and everything. So there's so many nods in this. It's amazing. But you're sort of like, you're these characters walk into this house and they're like, what the hell is this? And then for them to break into song, because the first thing I love, they break through the doors. They break through the doors into a sort of a chamber, and there's all these people in sort of like matching suits, but with slightly different coloured sort of, big glasses, and they've got the coloured waistbands and all this other stuff. And they're all there for a party, and they all just turn around, and all of a sudden they just break into song, and it's great. But you can sort of you are there with Brad and Janet going like, what the hell is going on? And I love Brad's response as they're trying to leave. They're backing out. And he's just like, well, they're clearly foreign and they're here to celebrate something. So let's not insult them, basically, and their folk dancing, which I think is fantastic. And I love that, just sort of like, he's so square, so normal. So, well, I really don't want to offend him. This is clearly nuts, but I'm not going to offend him. We'll just leave. And you're right. Like, you are just thrown into this and this song. And the energy of Richard O'Brien and Patricia Quinn when they do, like, they are in Brad and Janet's face, like, with the whole thing, that song, and it's a hell of a sort of, because the songs up until that point have been sort of fun but like campy, but that's the first one that's like a step up. So it's a really important song in the film. I hadn't realised it was a protest song. That's really interesting to see. But
well, I mean, that's my theory.
But it feels like a step up in energy. Like, you all of a sudden, it's that thing of, like you said about the Wizard of Oz. It's like, oh no, you are in Oz now. Like, these are the Munchkins. You're about to meet. You're about to meet the Wicked Witch, and you are in a different world. The door is closed behind you.
Yeah, and so much of it is enhanced by the decor of that mansion, right? I mean, you've got, like, a stuffed bird that, Magenta is sort of like caressing as she's singing, and nothing will ever be the same as she's caressing a stuffed bird. And, Riff Raff goes to, the clock is like in a coffin with a skeleton. And I mean, just the fact that everything is just, it looks like it's falling apart, and it's this odd, much like the movie, this kind of like odd collection of sort of pop culture knickknacks. And, you know, there are paintings in the background that are just, you know, like left there and, you know, don't seem to be maintained, and nothing seems to make sense. Yeah, and I think that you're right, that it really is a sort of, yeah, we're not in Kansas anymore. That you have sort of, that, you know, that first song is just kind of like establishing, I'm going to marry you, you know, we're prim and proper. And then the second one, the sort of Light at the Frankenstein Place, I think is a weaker one. But what I like about it is it's just kind of like about trying to find shelter and refuge. And so that kind of characterizes, you know, this falling into this other world, you know. And curiously, you know, they're driving in the car in the rain and they're listening to Nixon's resignation speech. And, you know, to leave office is indignity to every bone in my body, you know, and nothing, they never comment on it. It's just like in the background.
Yeah, it's just some, bizarre things. Because the other thing as well is to highlight, we should note, is, as you said before, there is this criminologist. So there's a whole sort of like fourth wall breaking as well. But I'll go one step further than fourth wall breaking. There's like a fifth and sixth wall breaking, because not only is the criminologist sort of, he's talking to us as an audience, and he appears out of nowhere because the film starts, and then all of a sudden he's like, and then you've got this, and he tells you about the events, and you know, you see him opening files on Brad, then Janet, then Professor Scott, and he is trying to explain what's going on, and that's a fourth wall breaking because he's talking to the audience. That, you know, is great. It gets better though, because then he starts to participate in the songs.
Yes.
So more than that, like he's a post-event contributor. Like he's talking to you from what would be our present. It's meant to be a retrospect, but he's also interplaying with the stuff that's going on in the film. And I just love that. I think it's great. I mean, you know, the way they play it, because let's say we talk about the time warp. It's like he's literally one of the earliest lines, because he pulls down a chart and he's like, it's just a jump to the left, and that's it. So yeah, it's a different energy from that point on. But I love the way that it's all set up in that sort of craziness. That you wouldn't again, this is something you won't get in other things for years. Like nothing else will touch this until you get to things, you know. Watch it this time made me think of like the current Doom Patrol TV show, but then maybe go back to things like Grant Morrison's Run and that thing of people pushing those boundaries. And I'm thinking like, yeah, that's people. Oh, it's groundbreaking in the 90s. And I was thinking, actually, someone did this in the 70s, like this level of weirdness. So yeah, no, it's really good fun on that front.
Well, and that book that he has is called The Denton Affair. You know, so it seems as if like, and he's got those files, right? But this is a book that, I mean, he's written in, it's got maps that he's clearly marked up, right? So what is this book? Is this like after the end of the movie and he's narrating the events, presumably? But then he, like you said, I mean, it's almost as if the time warp is so infectious that it infects the narrator. Right?
Exactly. But this is a theory again, and it didn't. I've been dipping. I make everything's about bloody Lovecraft. I have to, but this to me felt like The Color Out of Space. In that fact, like the film is a retrospective narrative. It's someone, they call it like, you know, the Color Out of Space is this thing, and they have this. They call it some. I forgot what's called in the story. But there's the farm that is affected by the alien color, and the family that's killed out, and obviously the people talk about it in this, because the story is like 25 years after the event, and people talk about it, and it is called, you know, the event of this thing, of this local legend, and it felt very much in that sort of almost Lovecraftian vein, in that same thing of things being told in that sort of retrospect of like, you know, it drove them mad, you know. There's no other description, but they went crazy in this event, and I don't know whether that's intentional or not, but it felt very much in that sort of vein. And the same as even like the Call of Cthulhu is a story within a story within a story. Like, you know, it's someone finds a book about someone who finds papers. And it felt like that almost, right. This is almost like a nod to this Lovecraftian thing of like, here's the straight-laced person, the Lovecraftian protagonist who's going to be the professional to relay the story. But we're going to pull him into this bizarre narrative. I don't know. That could be miles off, but it just felt like that to me this time watching it.
No, I mean that's there. I've never thought about it, but that's indisputably there. And I mean, it is also a sort of extra alien invasion that feels kind of like an extra dimensional sort of thing, and all about sort of twisting minds, right? I mean, it's not clear that I like to think that they're just that easily seduced, right? That their brains aren't being artificially manipulated. And in fact, you were talking about sort of like how square Brad is, and he ends the time warp thing by saying, "Say, do any of you guys know how to Madison?" And it's so lame. And what I noticed this time was Janet winces, and it's the first sign. Because at the beginning, it's just they're happy. She like giggles every time he talks. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of like the first sign that like, it's like, yeah, I love you, but I know you're kind of like.
Yeah. That's a really good point as well. Because she's the first to give in, isn't she? Not to give in, sorry, but that sounds bad, but to sort of be intrigued and to be seduced by this, because when they finally do, we'll get into Frankenfurter's introduction in a minute, but like after they've met him and they literally get stripped down to their undergarments, and then they go up to the laboratory after they meet Rocky, or even before that, she's the first one to join in the clapping. She's like with the dancers.
Yeah, right.
She's the first one, and Brad looks at her like, "What are you doing?"
Well, and then she said, she said, "I don't like men with too many muscles," and that pisses off Frank. But it's really clear in the scene that she's standing next to Brad, and she's kind of saying that for Brad's benefit. And then during that song about the Charles Atlas song, "I Can Make You a Man," she interjects and sings a line of the lyrics. "I'm a muscle man," and it's just like. And everybody just kind of looks at her like, "Oh, she's into this now."
Yes, yeah. It's interesting that she sort of leads the way in that sort of liberation, and Brad's that little bit more buttoned up and a bit more repressed. But what again about their relationship? Because again, their relationship is clearly. I don't want to say. I'm looking for the right word. Tarnish is the wrong word, but there's sort of like, does their relationship still exist at the end of the film? Because by the end of the film,
I love that question.
Because by the end of the film, like Rocky and all the end, it's all gone, and they're left. But she's obviously experienced something new. So's he. But he's sort of, even in that final song, like he says, "Oh, mommy," like he's still trying to cling on to something. But he's been seduced. He's enjoyed this sort of experience, and so. I do wonder at their relationship, like, is it sort of like, by the end of the film, are they still a couple? Or is it that they've both sort of gone, actually, we now both want something different? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome question. It's one that I definitely have thoughts about. I said sort of, I'm not as in love with the Rocky and Eddie parts of this. It is amazing to me, like when talking about Barbarella, like how much I love the second half. And I think that I am biased towards stories that end well. I can put up with, a little crap at the beginning. And this starts a little slowly, I mean, it's a church song. It's like, oh, we're getting married. Fuck these characters, right? I mean, but once you get to the freezing of the characters with the Medusa Ray, and you get to the floor show, and you have a medley of 3 songs all together. From that freezing of them onward, everything is impeccable and, just means the world to me. And in that floor show, Brad and Janet both, there's that sort of, as they're released, the 4 characters all give kind of sing their sort of like state of the character kind of songs. And Brad, that's where Brad says, "It's beyond me, help me, mommy." And Janet says, "I feel released," they're not the same people anymore. And this is why, also in the end credits, as the usher, you're right, the lips from the beginning. In the stage version, it was an usherette, that she sings the kind of like wrap up song. It says, "Darkness has conquered Brad and Janet." Well, that seems pretty definitive. And then you have the bit that was cut out from most versions, certainly the US version, which is this short superhero song at the end, where, this is so meaningful to me. They're crawling around, still dressed in fishnets and, stuff from this floor show, but covered with dirt, just like beaten up, and they're crawling around in the smoke, dazed and confused, and they sing their kind of wrap up bit. And they're left crawling around in the rubble, unable to find each other in the smoke.
Yeah.
I think, oh my God, like they're not coming back. Okay.
Well, it's a really good point, because one of the things I find interesting is, like, there's the bit where it's established, like, that they've each they both sort of had some sort of sexual relations with Frankenfurter. They've had some sort of awakening. And then, when Janet sort of basically doesn't give in, she makes the decision to sort of sleep with Rocky as well. And for the rest of that film, like, no point does Brad seem to get like pissed off about it, to be perfectly honest. Frankenfurter does. Frankenfurter's like, "You bitch," and he comes in and gets like really. But Brad is almost like shoulder shrugging by this point. At no point does he step up to defend or even contest it. It's just sort of like, I don't know whether these are sort of, is it him being a beta male or whatever, like in that sort of sense, or like giving in, or is it just him going, yeah, well, actually, I'm thinking there's other things at this point, and I'm not as bothered as I thought I would be. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question, and I find it part and parcel of sort of the odd depictions of character in the film. I did think about that, but remember when Brad is frozen just before the floor show, he, is sticking up for Jan, and that's when he's frozen. So he still has kind of like this alpha male thing, or those instincts, but he never seems to be that upset over Rocky. Maybe it's because he's jealous of Janet and not of Rocky, but
good point. Yeah. Because
but the other thing is, go ahead.
Because he said that about when him defending. He's defending, like, he's not so much defending that. He's defending her honor. Like, it's Frankenfurter who's insulting her, and he's willing to step in, which is almost like could just be a platonic thing. Like, well, I will step up for you because, he's being a complete douche about it. Like, at no point is it like, because otherwise he'd be after Rocky, wouldn't it? I mean, he wouldn't stand a chance. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, that relationship seems to turn, following that sort of their interactions with Frankenfurter.
Well, and I think that so many of the relationships in this film are complicated and are fascinating and are maybe not fleshed out in the way that you would expect. And I think that's one example. Another is, Columbia's reaction to Eddie. She clearly is madly in love with Eddie. She's got his, images all over her walls, like he's a rock star. And yet, she's still doing the bidding of the guy who put him on ice and took half his brain. And then has murdered Eddie in front of her. I mean, she screams and then goes right back to being a loyal minion. And then sees that they have all eaten Eddie, and her reaction is to politely say, "Excuse me," and go into the other room and cry. Which, cements, like, that sounds to me like a reaction to a traumatized reaction to tyranny. You're scared shitless of pissing off the tyrant there. But still, it's like that is almost never mentioned again. I mean, she mentions it in her sort of floor show wrap up. Similarly, like, Magenta and Columbia kind of fool around as they watch Frank seduce Janet and Brad, and they're sort of fooling around, and it's sort of like some light lesbian sort of play. but they're clearly like so happy watching this together, right? They're ecstatic. And then Magenta's fine with killing Columbia and Columbia being frozen and totally betraying Columbia. And just real quick, like Riff Raff at the end says, Columbia, I mean, Magenta is surprised that Riff Raff has killed them, which I don't know why. And Riff Raff says, they never lied to me, and he clearly is upset that he was like the Igor henchman that wasn't respected. But I mean, there's a lot of kind of like like characters who don't necessarily hold a grudge or react emotionally the way you'd think that they would.
No, I agree. I mean, the thing is, you say about the tyranny, like, to me, Frankenfurter is a cult leader. Like, they are enthralled to him, and there is no escape. And like you say, it's almost that thing, isn't it? Of he does terrible things, so I can either stay and enjoy the party, which is clearly, or I have to try and leave, in which case I put myself at risk. And so with Columbia, because even in the Time Warp, like the song, her segment of the Time Warp is clearly about her meeting Eddie. I was walking down the street, and he's clearly on her mind, and so she constantly backs down and backs down and backs down, and it's almost like conditioning, isn't it? Like, these things are going to happen, and I've had to deal with it, and I know something crazy is going to happen, but I'm not here for this. I'm not here for that little piece. I'm here for the big thing. Like, I'm here because this whole thing is amazing, sort of thing. And we talked about it a little bit before the show. Actually, we were talking about, sort of a lot of politics, but that idea of a line being drawn and then being crossed. And with Columbia, it seems like that thing, isn't it? Like, look, in order for me to stay here, I just have to. I will tolerate this, and then something else happens. I go, well, all right, well, I'll push back a little bit more, and I shall tolerate this. And she just seems to do it. For Magenta, though, sort of like, who we eventually find out is an alien, for her and Riff Raff, like, I just think they see them as playthings. Everybody else at that party, everybody else in the cult, the way they act it's almost like they're playthings, because throughout it, the Richard O'Brien, Riff Raff and Magenta, that when they roll their eyes at each other and they sort of have these little knowing glances and all this other stuff, it's like, they know stuff that nobody else in this party knows, in this house knows, and they're obviously planning whatever's going to happen. But it's almost like they've got no real respect for anything or anybody else in there, because they feel that they're better, they're superior to these people. So that's how I sort of took it. And it's so when you actually find out at the end that Riff Raff, the Richard O'Brien character, has actually got some resentment over being treated as the Igor character. Like, I find that really funny, because I'm sort of like, well, you clearly have done something different. Like, you accepted that role to an extent. But it's interesting how they do react. But I see them as being almost like, not so much psychopathic, because they are alien. It's almost, they just look down on everybody that's around them to an extent of like almost not caring.
Well, here's a question. Who is alien? I have always taken it as basically everyone in that house is from transsexual in the galaxy of Transylvania. But I'm not sure, like, why those guys are arriving on motorcycle. Are they like from this mansion, and they also came from transsexual, and then they're like just out joyriding, but they came back for this party? Or are these like human groupies, who are not telling anyone? I don't know.
I take it as that, because I take this as a cult. I take it that, for me, the only ones that are alien is Riff Raff, Magenta, and Frankenfurter. And obviously they've come to Earth, and it's almost like they've built this cult around them of these sort of, and they get, especially Frankenfurter, like you said to the end of the song, like the darkness has conquered Brad and Janet. I think that's the joy, the pleasure they got. And it's not about, darkness is probably too strong a term. It's not about corrupting people or making them evil or anything. they just get this thing of like that's their culture and whatever, so they're going to keep spreading it through this sort of like subversive invasion of sexual liberation. No, I always took it the way. I just took it they were the three, and everybody else was sort of were like cult members that have been brought into this Charlie and the Chocolate Factory kind of little sort of like they're like the Oompa Loompas. You know what I mean? They've been brought in for that purpose.
I love what you're saying about the cult. I'm thinking about like Wild Wild Country and documentaries about cults and stuff, and and a lot of the times they start with good intentions, right? But that kind of power differential is just so great that things kind of go off the rails as people try to serve that great leader, and as things just kind of become distorted over time. And there is a way in which, like, Frankenfurter is this sort of icon of liberation and of loving yourself, no matter who you are, dress how you want, and rip stockings, and you are fabulous, baby. And then, but like you say, it doesn't apply to others, right? And so Columbia has this, that whole like, you just use people up and throw them away. And Riff Raff, when he reveals he's betrayed Frankenfurter and he's going to kill him, he says, you've gone too far, right? like this project, this wonderful project, has gone too far. And one of the things that I like about this, beyond the sort of fear of the tyrant, the kind of cult thing, is there is a way in which in Rocky, the project itself of indulging, giving yourself over to absolute pleasure, is always intertwined with a kind of pain, that it seems to lead to pain, but it also is a kind of cure for pain. And so it seems logical within that kind of world that all of these characters, like, Columbia, would become kind of warped and wounded over time by this experiment, however noble and weird it is.
Yeah, no, and that's how I sort of feel about it. It's that sort of like, it is a liberation, and it's clearly a liberation for both Brad and Janet. Like, it awakens something in them, like a realization. However, on the flip side of that, as you say, like, Frankenfurter creates Rocky for his own personal pleasure. There's no liberation there, because at some point you find out later on. There's a great little scene, but in fact, there's two things I'll say there, because when he's created, like, there's a real sort of the sexual excitement that comes from Frankenfurter, sort of seeing this sort of like muscular body and stuff. And again, I'll just praise Tim Curry throughout this, because he has got this performance down to perfection. Like, his emotions, or his tone, like, shifts on a dime. And that's the other thing. Like, he's temperamental. He's not stable. And so there's a moment when Rocky, like you say, he gets pulled up and he does the Damocles song and he's running around. And there's like the desperation of Frankenfurter, who's like literally chasing him around the room to catch up with him. And I love that it's played. It's played for comedy. Like, he's pushing people out the way, and he's frantically trying to catch up to him, to try and convince him, like, no, you have to stay with me, darling. I'm the fabulous one. And in trying to, get that across. But then when, and then at the end of that whole segment, they go off to their bridal suite, and then the doors close. When you finally return to Rocky, and it's Riff Raff who sort of goes in to look at him, and you get the Frankenstein moment, the Frankenstein's monster moment, like, he scares him with the candles, and he sort of growls and stuff back, which is, again, a great nod to the original Frankenstein the film of being taunted, and sort of the Karloff one. But you find out he's chained to the bed.
Yes.
So he isn't to be liberated. He is there to be used. He was created, and he is there for somebody else. He's a toy, basically. Like, he is there to be used for somebody else, for Frankenfurter's pleasure. So this idea of Frankenfurter being this sort of like sexual liberator, there'll be as other fans, when this goes out, I'll be interested in what people come back with. But to me, like, if you want to sort of take that from the film, like it is there. But that is not, to me, what Frankenfurter is. Frankenfurter is this narcissist who has built this around him for his own pleasure. And I think that's where it's gone, where you sort of say, Riffraff's saying it's taken it too far, because it's like, yeah, everybody should be enjoying this party, not just you. So I do find that sort of like, because Rocky's a sympathetic character in this, in this whole thing. And he is played as Adam should be in the Frankenstein story, that sort of like, if you go back to the Shelley story, like he isn't the torn up monster that's sort of the Karloff one. He is a perfectly looking human and stuff. And so he's a sympathetic character. Like, he's brought into this world to be used and abused. And that's his purpose. And that's quite sad, really.
Well, you say that like it's a bad thing, Scott.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have trouble identifying with Rocky. Probably because he's, the sort of jock muscular type, but also because he's brain dead. He sort of seems to be a toy, and you're entirely right. I mean, those chains are, they're there, and they have to be broken in order to even rig the deck and have Rocky escape, by being taunted by Riffraff and Magenta. But I've also felt like when Janet seduces Rocky, Rocky has run away. He's been chased like Frankenstein's monster, and he's hidden in the laboratory, and Janet, having a sort of existential crisis that she's cheated on Brad, just hours after getting engaged to him, finds Rocky, and there's this wonderful scene of, she tears her dress to sort of bandage his wounds, and then Rocky kind of looks at her, and you see the romantic intent, and Susan Sarandon looks sort of off to the side towards the camera like, nobody will know. Yeah. I want to do this. And it's such a delightful moment, but also if you see Rocky as somebody who's just been created, who, obviously Susan Sarandon is a comparative innocent, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to put the blame on Janet Weiss here, but if Rocky is this sort of half-witted newborn who doesn't understand any of this, she's taking advantage of him. Yeah. Not as clearly as Frankenfurter is, but she's implicated too.
Yeah. And is it a further sort of sign of the darkness, as I put in inverted commas, the sort of like, that I don't want to use again the word corruption seems too strong, but that sort of notion of sort of like that. Well, let's say nobody will know, and it's actually what I want to do. It's true though, because he could be like seen as a child character, like he's new and he's innocent. And funnily enough, we talked about when we discussed Barbarella in the last episode, we talked about the sort of the innocence and the naivety and the purity of Barbarella overcoming the evil of the Matt Moss and all this other stuff, and how how sort of her sexual encounters didn't defile her in any way. Like her purity and innocence is maintained despite, or not, even regardless of those. Like it's not, they're like a non-entity. This film sort of says something different of sort of well, that's that giving into that. I don't know. Does it say that it's a corruption? I don't know. And I'm coming up from the wrong end. Maybe I'm a real sort of uptight white British guy who's now coming in. This whole film's about corruption. Maybe I should be joining sort of like the Mary Whitehouse group.
I don't think there's any risk of that, Scott.
But there could be an argument that this film is actually the message this film is given is actually like, whilst it can be good, maybe there's that thing of like, well, you need control as well, because you have the risk of becoming Frankenfurter.
Yes, it definitely is saying that. I think that I love that sort of innocence in Barbarella. It has a kind of power in Barbarella. Frankenfurter, he's the one I love. He's the one I identify with. I want to be, if there's one character I want to be, it's Frankenfurter, right? I don't especially identify with Brad and Janet. I enjoy seeing them corrupted. I want them to be exposed as hypocrites. So, yeah, but you're right. And I think that there are things that are problematic about this film. And that's certainly one of them. Some of Frankenfurter's behavior is like that. And I think that it seems to be both. Like, this movie is clearly celebrating that liberation, right? Frankenfurter is charismatic. You're supposed to love him. I mean, and it is transgressive. I mean, even when he reveals himself and throws off that cloak, he is fabulous. Yeah. And I defy any straight person to sit here and tell me that he's not amazing and fabulous, right? And you feel that, and then he leaves with Rocky, and the wedding music plays, which you've just seen the kind of like straight Christian version of. And but you're right, it is depicted as a corruption. He does abuse Rocky. He does abuse Columbia. He has abused Riff Raff. And I think there is this way in which the film sort of has it both ways and wants that liberation, but also sees that it can go too far, but also that liberation is a response to pain. I mean, that really comes through in the floor show that, I've seen blue skies through the tears in my eyes. I mean, this has all been some way to medicate and cope with pain. And I do think that this reflects, I mean, we're talking like, 1975, the musical was a little before that. I think it really reflects the era and the era's understanding of like LGBTQA issues. So, like there's this kind of like response to the counterculture of the 50s of of the 60s of kind of like, well, we kind of went too far and burned ourselves out, right? Like, 69 was going to be the year where the revolution happened, and, we dropped acid, and, we had Woodstock, and it all just became corporate Nixon stuff. Nixon won. And, so there's kind of parallel to that, but also in all the interviews of people that I've seen of people in the LGBTQ community at that time, there was a lot of self-hatred, and if you're going to clubs where the cops raid and beat people up regularly, and you can't be out for fear that, you're not only is your wife going to leave you, but you'll be fired instantly because nobody, who's prominent wants to associate with a publicly out homosexual. And they would print the names in the newspapers when they would raid this stuff. And that kind of culture contributed to, the sort of like bathhouse culture that now has kind of been eschewed by the LGBTQ community, partly as an attempt to like gain mainstream acceptance, which has been, God bless it, I mean, an amazingly successful attempt. But that kind of like bathhouse culture and, like dirty anonymous sex kind of edge, right, has been lost. And maybe that was only a response to pain and self-hatred of the time. Maybe that was something positive that some people, within the community have complained that has been, the edginess of what they were doing, of their identity doesn't have a place anymore. These are complex issues. I'm not the expert on them, but I do think that kind of like, it's a very 70s depiction of that kind of liberation tied to sexuality, and especially pansexuality or homosexuality.
No, I completely see what you're saying, especially around the 70s. And because obviously this came out in 75, and to me, I think, when I born in 81, so, come up during the 80s and stuff, and when I look back at those films that I think of that sort of talk to the sort of through the queer community or the LGBTQ community as a kid, or even as a young teen or something, when you watch them, it was never a positive depiction. I think of films like the Al Pacino film Cruising, which gave it a very sort of sleazy Dog Day Afternoon. So Al Pacino clearly did a lot, but Dog Day Afternoon, had that sort of mania and manic sort of thing about it in the 70s. Because it was all marred in the machoism that had sort of come out of that era. And so even into the 80s, I think of films like where that gay community and everything was ridiculed. I mean, think about the Police Academy films. Like, it's a bloody. They've got the Blue Oyster Bar, which is a constant reoccurring joke throughout that entire series, or even sort of like Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which has got the whole leather scene and stuff in it. That was the gay scene, the leather scene, like, the bears and stuff. That was how it was depicted, and sort of like, to me as a kid growing up, that's what that's your first sort of that's what you're conditioned to probably when you come through the 80s and early 90s. But for this film to come out in 75, and like you say, for that opening, that introduction in that machoistic sort of 70s era, when you've got Dirty Harry sort of like, on the other side of things, the sort of like the staunch Republican copper, and then you've got Tim Curry coming out and literally sort of like, throwing off that cloak, and like you say, just being going like, I am fabulous. And like I when you see it, there's a joy in that reveal, just an absolute thrill in it, because it is, and then for him to sort of just to sit atop his throne, because that's what it is. It's a throne of that room. Is almost like it's a victory for him and for that sort of thing of like that alternative of just like, basically it's a fuck you. Yeah. I don't care how many mustachioed 70s, hairy men are going to sort of try and sort of, say I'm macho that. I don't care, because we are going to live this way. And that's fantastic. Like, that is really brave. And even
and he's made a little realm for himself in which not only can he do what he wants, but he can be loved for it and accepted for it. And the Brad Majors of this world, the repressed, I'm a Christian and I'm going to save myself from marriage. Yeah. It's got to be, God didn't do no Adam and Steve, those types, give them a few hours in, that was the reality of the bathhouses, right? Was, there were so many people who were public officials who were crusading against homosexuality, who, everybody knew within the gay community went to those places. That's still happening today. How many Republicans in America keep having these gay sex scandals where, they're caught in a public bathroom or something?
What's the most recent one? Less of a scandal because there's so much to be going on. But they give them a name, haven't they? Like Madame something or other. Is it the lead? Is it the leader of the Senate or the leader of the House? I can't remember who it is now. Mitch McConnell, Madam McConnell.
Is it Mitch McConnell?
Yeah. And they call him the Crazy Mitch or something like that. I can't remember what it's called now, but they've got a nickname for him anyway. But you think about it, even in the 90s, this thing you say, the bathhouse culture in Britain, obviously there was it was referred to as like the public toilet scene. Like George Michael was arrested,
right?
For gay sex in a public toilet. It was a lewd act.
Well, and Thatcher said she wanted to eradicate the concept of homosexuality, to remove it from the dictionary, remove it from the minds of people that's even a possibility that human beings could do. I mean, and I think that kind of stuff, I think there's some of that kind of bathhouse culture stuff that we look back on nostalgically. And, we have watched these movies and, I've known people who participated in that culture. But there's also a way in which, psychologies were twisted by all of this hate and all of this, like I can be arrested for this and we have to be anonymous or I'll lose everything. There's a way in which psychologies were twisted by that. And I think that plays out in sort of Frankenfurter's, I've made my kingdom here, but, I'm going to use Rocky, what's wrong with that? I'm enjoying this. I made him and I'm in charge here. So I think you're right, but I do think, but I think it goes beyond just a kind of self-hatred or kind of reflection of the 70s or kind of mixed view. I think at its best, it gets into that thing that, that the whole floor show stuff with the, cards for sorrow, cards for pain, blue skies, through the tears in my eyes, in which it's really clear that all of this is a kind of compensation for for pain and sorrow and heartbreak. And, and I do think that there is a way in which, some people have a kind of vision of sexuality as just is something, the Barbarella thing, right? It's just something positive that people do. It's a fun thing that humans do with other humans. It's just an activity, it can bring people closer together, but, don't be so hung up, brother. And then there's another version that's sort of like, no, this is tied to deep stuff psychologically, and this touches nerves, and we want desperately, and we are jealous, and we want to die and want to kill people over love and lust. This is something powerful within us, and it can be a kind of recompense for having been beat up or for, going through these bad experiences. It can be healing, but it is bound up in these complex parts of our identity that are painful, and that whether we have shame because of society, or shame because we just hate ourselves, or don't know who we are, or had parents who hit us, or whatever, sexuality touches on these things that do make us cry and are painful. And so I think at its best, it gets at that, which I really like, even though it's totally different than the version presented in Barbarella.
No, I agree. And it's interesting that the change that the characters go through, we'll get to the stage show, the whole sort of third act of the finale, really, which again, I think is fantastic. But there is an element of this, of what you say, that final, the superhero song, the end. So you get Susan Sarandon and sort of singing it, sort of like, and that sort of it's to me this song, it pulls out and it leaves them there in the rubble, and then you get the sort of the voiceover a little bit, and then it goes out. And there is a part of me that does think like they've got to go home after this. Like there's a story. This is the event. This is a triggering event. Like. But there's more. If you were to look at this as sort of like, I know this is the fun musical thing, but if you were to follow this through, to be like, what the hell happens next for Brad and Janet and Professor Scott? Like, they've got to go back to their world, and especially, Professor Scott could just go back to his thing. Like, he can be like, yeah, in fact, I'm keeping the stockings on, and to hell with the rest of you. But Brad and Janet have got to go back. They're college kids. They've come out of college. They're going to start work. They've just been, they've just got engaged. Like, they've got to go back to their sort of very sort of staunch, probably very normal families and something. Like, there's a whole different thing there of like, how do they carry on? And that comes to that thing of like, the LGBT community. How do you come out to your family and friends? What are people going to say about it? How are they going to accept me or not? Will I maintain this era, jobs, friendships, status, the works. It's interesting. I think like it's almost a shame that you don't get to see the fallout of this event, really. But yeah, the other thing I was going to say is, you say about sort of Frankenfurter, and one of the things about his thing, there's a line in it's almost like a lament, really, in one of the songs. It's "Don't dream it, be it."
Yes, amen.
And I have to admit that is almost the sort of like the statement of intent to this film. It's like, and he's in the pool. Which, again, I love this whole finale thing is amazing. I would love to see this on stage. It must be incredible. That thing,
well, this is he falls into the pool, and it's this wonder that the smoke is concealing the pool, and the smoke drifts away from his impact. And it's a wonderful overhead shot in which you see at the bottom of the pool is Michelangelo's creation of man, and, obviously like this whole thing, forbidden fruit, right? He's literally sort of God having made, the modern Prometheus, right? He's made his own man. He's also the tempter, right? He's also the snake. Yeah. He's sort of playing both roles here. He's created this kind of Garden of Eden, but it's a hellish Garden of Eden. And then he's even on his little life preserver is from the Titanic.
Yeah, I love that. That was one of the things I loved. I was like, he's now the head of a sinking ship, and I was like, some of the thought is fantastic. I do love that, and to have him that lament of like, don't dream it, be it. Of just sort of like do what you've got to do, and I think that's a great moment. But when the four of them are reanimated, they've all been turned into statues in some way, using the Medusa device. When they are reanimated and they give their sort of, like you say, their sort of status in song, there's a moment in like he's in the pool and the four of them there, and they all dive in. And for that moment, it's like a moment of sort of pure pleasure for them, because the songs, the music's going on, but they're all sort of like swimming around each other, and as you say, like, you know, they're all sort of it's almost like an orgy in the water. Of, you know, Brad is kissing Rocky, and then the kiss, and then there's some kissing Frankfurter, and they're all entangled and entwined, and Columbia's there as well. And it's almost like it's that sort of moment of giving in to one's lust and pleasure, and it's almost like that moment of pure joy. Like there's no hang-ups, there's no you know, as you sort of said, emotional entanglement. It's just a moment of pleasure and joy, and then it's sort of brought to a sort of a thundering halt with the you know, when it's interrupted and stuff. But that's that when I talked about Brad and Janet and their relationship before, like that tells me at that point, one of the reasons that Brad is sort of like not so bothered about all this is because I think he has detached himself from that thing of realizing there's more. And he's almost like, well, I can't be jealous of that because I've done the same thing, to be perfectly honest. You know, and I'm just giving into a thing. And I almost have got to respect his pragmatism in that point of like, you know, I mean, you know, he seems quite sort of very well balanced throughout it all, but to approach it in that way of like, I can't be jealous or angry with her for sleeping with Rocky because, well, yeah, I've done the same. And so they are very sort of like, you know, it seems quite clean cut, but that moment is really cool. Like, you know, it's that sort of, that's the antithesis of the film. And then obviously it gets brought down. And there's a bit I want to get to in a minute, but what are your thoughts on that bit in the pool then with all those, the four of them dive to join in Frankenfurter?
Well, I mean, my response to it is religious, frankly. I mean, I think, you know, you're right. I mean, be it, don't dream it. I mean, should be the mantra of this film. It's not entirely, as you point out, you know, it's complex. It's not entirely clear to me if Janet, Brad, Rocky, and Columbia aren't maybe like a little mind controlled or something in that pool scene, you know, through the whole floor show. But the joy on their faces. I mean, you're right. There's this, you know, sort of the tongue sticking out, you know, just kind of like licking each other and just sort of swimming over each other. But also just like, we've seen them go through so much, and to see that kind of like unadulterated joy on Brad's face, Brad, the uptight dickwad, you know, I mean, the joy he has swimming in drag, you know, in face paint underwater and just letting go, man. I mean, to me, that it's a transcendent scene. It's, you know, in the small number of things that are as close as I have to religion, it means a lot to me.
It's funny because it's countered. This is why I find this finale, because it is complicated and it's really beautifully done. Is that it's countered as like that's almost Frankenfurter at his peak. That's him achieving this thing of sort of like whether it be control and people giving into the whether it be the cult of personality or mind control or whatever it is, but that's him at his peak. And then to have it crashing down and for Riff Raff and Magenta to come in and to bring it to a crashing conclusion. And for him then to provide the song, as you say, about sort of like seeing blue sky through the tears. But there's another bit when it's because it's the going home. It's sort of like it's him giving in. He's giving himself up. And again, to get back to that sort of narcissism and stuff, though, to see how he sees the world just for a second. And he walks between the aisles because it's a theatre. Like the last it's a literal stage show, that last bit. And he walks between the two sort of the aisle between the two sets of chairs. And as he's doing so, it fills with people. And they're all looking to get his autograph, and they're all sort of like, you know, fawning over him and everything he's doing. And he's like, and it's all that kind of stuff. And then he reaches the Magenta and Riff Raff, and he looks back, and it's just the desolate, empty chairs, and then the confused looking four people on stage about it. And there's a moment of like real like heartbreak for Frankenfurter when he realizes like this is gone. Everything I sort of worked up to, this is what I'm left with, an empty theatre. And to me, it almost represents, you've seen that crowd of dancers and supporters and all the people that are around him. And that empty theatre is literally, that is a moment, the way the film shows it. Like, no, it's all gone. All that you had before is gone. All those falling people, gone. And it is that there's a real look of heartbreak on Tim Curry. Again, which is why I think he's so good in this. But it's heartbreaking for him to see that. But it's beautifully done.
Yeah, and I think that it's not entirely clear to me that it is gone, in the sense that there are still all those people at the party, right? I mean, he's still got followers who are willing to follow him. I mean, he could have, in theory, stocked that theater with, scared supporters, with the noisemakers. But you're right. I mean, I think it is kind of heartbreaking. But even before that, when you see, there's the flow show starts with the four characters on stage, and you go through their sort of statement of their status quo, and then you get that, the RKO swelling music, and you cut to, the wonderful love of B sci-fi movies, and you zoom in on Frankenfurter, and he makes his appearance. I find myself thinking, yeah, you're doing this for an empty room, Bubba. Think about, I mean, even the people on stage, they're performing. They're facing the audience, right? They're made to come alive again, but they're still clearly facing an audience, and they're using their boas, and, there is a sense of performance. Who is he revealing himself to? This is that kind of narcissism. I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I identify with that, frankly. I'm sympathetic with that. I never, saw an empty auditorium that I didn't think I should be talking to and should be filled with people, So I identify with that. But yeah, it is sad that it is this kind of like moment where he's done this spectacular sort of floor show, and for whom? What was the point of this? Really, the only people watching him are two people, who have decided to betray him.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, I mean, you can tell it's for his own purposes. Like, this is his own. This is him just entertaining himself. But it is a great entrance as well. I don't know. I think that's the only way to take it. Like, is he in his head? Like, maybe he doesn't see. He knows it's an empty auditorium, but it's still, as you say, it's still a stage. Maybe to him, like, the whole world is a stage. Like, he's never off. Do you know what I mean? Like, because even when he's actually doing actual science in this, all the science fiction, the mad scientist stuff, like, he's still on. Like, it's still wearing. It's still like 100% fabulous, like even in his sort of like scrubs and stuff. So it's just almost like a notch up from that, really. I don't know. I think it's just for him to sort of to have those four people in a show. Again, it's that thing about adulation and the control of it. That's the only way I can sort of see it. But
I think you're right, and I think the riffraff and magenta seem to represent there, like, how he has, I mean, maybe not just gone too far, but neglected the people, right? I mean, he has not been interested in building real relationships. He's been performing, right? Like you say, he's always on. He's never once gone to, Columbia and said, look, I know I'm moving on with Eddie, but I still love you, baby, or sorry, I killed your one lover, but I mean, he's never gone to Riff Raff and said, hey, buddy, thanks. You want to jump in here?
Yeah. There's no appreciation. It's just he just expects everybody to keep going with the ongoing party. And you do hear that. I mean, you hear about that sort of, there are stories from people that are like that. I mean, from the sort of the New York party scene in the late 80s and into the 90s, there were people that sort of like that did create these followings around them, and that were just on all the time. And when you hear stories about it, I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a guy who ended up killing somebody else and then had like the body
Yeah.
in his house for however long. So
The movie Party Monster is about it.
that's what, yeah, Macaulay Culkin and stuff. And that, but again, like, when I read about that, it was like, well, he just expected people to help him. Like, there was no people that barely knew him. He was like, well, you've been to my parties, you know me, just you're going to help, sort of thing. And it's like the same thing. Like, you know, I'm not your friend. I know you, and you exist in my world, so I fully expect you to do these things for me. And I think he's very much that's what Frankenfurter is like, and it's but how much is that has been fed to him as well? Because it's been allowed to happen. Like Riff Raff and Magenta could have easily stopped this at any point by the look of it, unless, I mean, again, you don't know the hierarchy of this. Mm-hmm. You know, did they come? Was he their Captain Kirk? You know, is this a sort of like a, you know, was he the leader of this and they had like a hierarchy and they were just following orders, or is it? I don't know. I don't, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there are. Well, first of all, there's a sequel. There's a sequel to this that was made as a movie. It's not great. It was called Shock Treatment, and Richard O'Brien made it.
Yes.
It's a musical.
A direct sequel to this.
Well, it stars Brad and Janet, just recast, and they're in Denton, and Denton is, you know, sort of taken over by, you know, TV people, and, you know, there's this, you know, mental institution, but that's Denton, and that's Brad and Janet post Rocky, and in that one they're married, you know, and it's just like they've you know, they're like, okay, we got over that, which I don't like. I mean, I don't think that's the right thing. And then Richard O'Brien has worked on different sequel proposals. And there's a script for one of them online. And apparently, I mean, obviously this hasn't been made, so it's not canon. Apparently, you know, in that, it's called like Revenge of the Old Queen. And Frankenfurter was the biological son, or the, you know, now we'd say, you know, identified male at birth, child of, you know, this old dying queen of transsexual. And so Riff Raff and Magenta were sort of like his lieutenants. And he was sort of like, yeah, you know, the Captain Kirk, but Captain Kirk, who was like the prince of transsexual. So, and in that one, Brad was, I think he was in a Las Vegas show, and he died in a trapeze accident, you know, which seems more like what Brad would end up doing after this movie.
Yeah. I never knew Shock Treatment was, because Arrow Video have got that on Blu-ray, so I'm going to have to get hold of that and see it. But yeah, you know, I'd love to see that. Yeah, because I always think, like I say, if they don't end up together, like those are going to go off and do something different. And I can imagine, I imagine sort of like Brad becoming part of like you say, a 70s drag act. You know, yeah. and doing something fabulous on stage there. That's interesting to sort of say about the hangovers, especially for those characters. But like you say, there's a whole sort of thing here about, because it's a culture. There's clearly, you know, transsexual in the galaxy of Transylvania. Like, what is that? They've clearly established interstellar travel. You know, they've got all this advanced technology. What is that world? Like, I want to see that. That sounds incredible.
Well, apparently, you know, there was an abandoned sequel, and, you know, made like around or at least a draft was completed of the script around 1990 that would have shown you that. Yeah, I mean, it is unfathomable. I mean, I want to see that too, although I don't know, you know, if it's not good, then, you know, it could kind of ruin it. But you could see it done as a kind of like, you know, Buck Rogers kind of fun sort of thing. But, you know, while we're on that subject, I love, you know, it's weird. Like, they could have just gone back at any time. I do want to say, I want to see a version of Star Trek with Frankenfurter as the captain. You know, like, view screens on, my darling. You know, like, your problem, Klingons, is you need more feathered boas.
Yes.
But I do love those songs where they're singing about, you know, like Riff Raff and Magenta they do the elbow sex, you know, thing, which is obviously like this really intimate, strange, wonderful thing. I don't know if it's a thing that everybody does on transsexual, or it's just like this just wonderful idiosyncratic bodily connection that they have. But when they, when she says, and we will go back to the sweet transsexual, there's this love of home that even comes through in, the I'm Going Home song that, transsexuals made out to be like this really wonderful place that somehow they didn't want to go back to.
Yeah.
Or at least Tim Curry did it.
No, and again, is that because he found this little empire that you said he created this little kingdom? So going back would be going back to a level of normality and stuff where, he's like, no, here I can do whatever the hell I want. I don't know. It's interesting because it sort of it ends on a bit of a downer note. I mean, spoilers, everything, but obviously they kill Frankenfurter. But one of the things I found interesting is Rocky is they get shot. Frankenfurter gets shot with a laser gun, and so does Columbia. He kills Columbia, then he kills Frankenfurter, and then Rocky retrieves the body and starts climbing the RKO sign. Clearly, obviously an homage to sort of Frankenstein and the windmill, or even King Kong and the Empire State Building. But when he's getting shot, the lasers bounce off him, and I was just like, is this going to lead to something? Is it supposed to mean something? No, it's just a moment in it. It's just sort of the effects aren't great because obviously low budget, but it's an interesting because for everything that's happened, Rocky retrieves the body, and I'm not entirely sure where he thinks he's going, but it's a bit of a downbeat ending across the board, really.
I love that bit where he goes to the body. He's been, you pointed out, he's been abused by Frankenfurter, right? I mean, he's been used sexually. He didn't seem to mind, but then he was left tied to the bed. Hey, we had some fun, but now I'm going to make sure you don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Because that would be inconvenient for me. But they've been on the outs. He seemed to embrace Janet, which obviously, infuriated Frankenfurter. But then he goes to that body. And boy, I mean, Tim Curry looks dead. He's been zapped with a laser. He looks dead, and it's so beautiful the way Rocky, this person who did to be used. Who Rocky in the end is the one that goes to him and embraces that body, and he kind of just has this animal instinct to body high, see, get it up there in that tree or whatever. But it's very touching to me, the way you'd think that, Columbia would do that or somebody else would do that. But Rocky, who's just been created, is the one in the end who is there for Frank and wants to, take care of him.
Yeah, to sort of retrieve him and protect him in some way. Yeah, it is interesting. But again, it goes back to that it's another nod to the Frankenstein thing, isn't it? Sort of about the sort of the creator and the creation, sort of the bond there, I suppose. And it sort of touches on that. It is. It's a good ending. I mean, like you say, it's a downbeat. The only people that seem to win is Riff Raff and Magenta because they get to go home. Although if those people that are there at the party are still there, and they're probably all passed out from excessive drug use and orgy, they're going to have a hell of a hangover when they wake up on a different planet, sort of
presuming they're human, right? I mean, I don't know. I'd like to see that movie, right?
Yeah. But yeah, let's say the end, it is sort of they get left behind or they escape, and to be left sort of and that's sort of the you are left with the Denton event. Which means they reported it more than anything, which is
I don't know. And then there was those police reports in that book, and I'm thinking, who are these police reports by? Do we think that there's one for Brad and one for Janet and one for Dr. Scott? Does that mean that the three of them have each reported it? I mean, I guess Dr. Scott works for the CIA. I mean, he's going to recover, and unless they kick him out for liking stockings now, he's going to have some insight into, I saw these aliens from transsexual we've been chasing. I don't know what's going to happen there.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like the kind of thing. Because the thing is, if you really were to sort of boil it down, there's nothing here that the police would be interested in. There are people dead, no doubt, but prove it, because there's also no house.
Right. There's no bodies,
Yeah,
right?
there's no bodies, there's no house. It's all gone. It's just an empty lot. So, if anything, if I was the three of them, I'd be a bit like, right, this never happened, or at least sort of like, if it happened, like this has changed us all. Let's just go ahead of our lives and we never refer to this again, because people are going to think like, although I can experience it and I can go on and change in some way, like people are going to think we're mad if we explain that some interdimensional, interstellar beings came across, gave us a sexual awakening, and then disappeared in a flying mansion.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
I mean, if Brad and Janet don't wind up together, how are they ever going to start another relationship?
Yeah.
How are they going to explain, like, well, when I was just out of college, I met this sweet transvestite from Transylvania, and, I'm into some things now, and we're going to have some fun together. I don't know. It is very hard. I mean, I guess like Dr. Scott has the respect within the government to maybe be able to be believed if he reports this stuff, hypothetically. But I do love the downer ending. I mean, it's like, we did Quatermass in the Pit, and I love that ending. Like, it's such a just, again, it's that same kind of like, we're in the rubble, right? Like, this has been terrible and we're in the rubble. I love those downer endings. And I mean, it feels so right for Rocky though. And it also part and parcel of the time of like the sexual awakening. It takes something out of you. And also those nerves have all been opened in these characters. It's not just that they've learned to embrace sex and, so what? You're not a virgin anymore, Janet. Who were you saving it for? But like, Brad, that repression that Brad felt, right? That he probably still feels, but doesn't feel by the pool scene. That came from somewhere. There's some hurt in him. There's some, the internalization of some terrible social shit that he's got inside him that he knows is there now. So yeah, it's gonna be a sad ending.
Yeah, it seems. I suppose for me, because again, I do quite enjoy sort of downer endings and stuff like that. Like with Quatermass, I do like that. I think it's because it's a musical, and I associate musicals being probably more with those sort of Hammer and Burns. The Hammer. What's it? Is it sort of the Sound of Music or Oklahoma or anything like that?
Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Rodgers, Hammerstein, Grease. All have a sort of like a happy ending, and although I'll get on, there's a couple of points. If you go to Greece, like there's another sort of a musical about something, has the exact opposite sort of message of instead of embrace who you are, that's sort of like change who you are to satisfy your partner. So very different message. But that's why. So to have a downer ending for a musical, I find unusual. 2 points I wanted to raise actually, just quickly. One of them, because this film's about, I know it's set at a certain period and it has its very own sort of political agenda, but one of the things that I found unusual, and again, this is seen through the lens of 2020 and everything that's going on. Rocky being depicted as the perfect human, as a blonde, white, muscled being, is somewhat of troublesome these days. He's incredibly Aryan.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just sort of like it's fine in that, like, there are people that are very attractive that are, he clearly is, he's very well muscled, he's blonde, it's fine, he exists. But it's the fact that they go on about it being that sort of like the perfection of the human form is a little bit in this day and age. I mean, granted, the film's like 45 years old sort of thing, like. But still, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I haven't thought about that all that deeply, but you're obviously correct. I mean, it seems as if that feels to me like a kind of internalization of social values, right? And I think, that gets into sort of how we internalize values about accepted sexuality. But it also gets into, I mean, I think this is true for both men and women, that if, we've had a lot of conversations in the last few years about sort of body typing and how damaging that is to women, especially. It's also damaging to people, whether it's body typing of male or female. It's also damaging to us in terms of what we imagine our ideal lovers to be. So how many guys have, had loving partners that they had a beautiful relationship with, but they thought, she's not a 10,
Yeah.
And, I think that internalization of, what's so weird is I sometimes get tripped up by this, right? Because like throughout human history, we've always had, especially an idealized female body type, right? Probably a male too, but the female one was more enforced. It used to be a fat body type that indicated wealth. That indicated, you had fat for the winter, and she was a rich, wonderful woman, and that was prized. Once we had a capitalist surplus, that starts to shift. I think due to physical reality, as well as that produce cultural change. But what I find it fascinating that these things are things that are outside of us, but we can't fully escape them, right? I mean, whether we're male or female, you can say, fat is beautiful. You can be into, goth chicks and emo chicks and tattoos and, mohawks and all kinds of things. But this sort of these body types and these images, whether they're on billboards of women or they're, the Rocky thing, persist in our minds and have a kind of weight, exert a kind of psychological weight that we can't entirely free ourselves of. So, and that I think are damaging. So, I mean, that's all I can think of is like, I mean, you're right. I think there's a lot of stuff that's problematic about this film. Transvestite is not a word that is used anymore. There's no recognition of, and I know Richard O'Brien has come out as trans, and, that's awesome. And those terms didn't even exist back then. And I think you're entirely right that that's one of the things that doesn't age. All I can think of is, for me, it's bound up in that kind of sexual psychology of, pain, wanting this liberation, but having these nerves and this pain.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, there's many ways to take it. It just struck me as being, as I say, from a different period, a different age, and also, like you say, there are representations. He's supposed to be a representation of Charles Atlas, who was obviously of that body type and that sort of like, the look. It's just because he's so blonde, it does hold a bit of a sort of like from 2020. But again, you could just simply say, actually, that's just Frankenfurter's preference at this point, because let's be honest, like in Rocky you have that, but then you meet Meatloaf playing Eddie, and in Eddie, like he found pleasure and enjoyment in that, and he's a podgy dude. I love Meatloaf. I got he was sort of my introduction to sort of rock music and metal and stuff at a certain point, and and then obviously like Columbia's got a different body type to Susan Sarandon. So for Mr. Frankenfurter, like it doesn't matter. It's just whatever takes his fancy at any one point. But it's just interesting that they have that depiction of him being the muscle man. You say about the body types. It's interesting that I like to think I have the perfect body of a Victorian industrialist. In that I'm relatively pasty and round, because that was it. It was that depiction of wealth. Sort of like if you have servants, you are not muscly or anything because people do things for you. And that was obviously the change. And I suppose it like you said, it changed actually as far as post World War One. Was when you get the sort of social shifts and stuff, and that body type in the 20s and 30s starts to shift towards that the leaner, sort of more athletic, and actually that sort of goes then into it's both American. Ironically, it's both American and is a big part of Nazi Germany. That sort of like health and sort of doing all that sort of thing. And then it progressed into the 50s post World War II with things like Charles Atlas and all that other stuff. So, yeah, the body type is interesting. I actually read an article, obviously, recently about how superheroes have been a real problem on that front, both for male and female. Like we obviously depict about the sexualization of females through sort of characters from Wonder Woman in a short skirt and through to, costumes that sort of seem to emphasize boobs in a really unrealistic way, especially throughout the 90s. But then this article sort of kicked back and said, well, does anybody wear clothes, for males that wear clothes, that their abs are that defined? So I suppose body image is an interesting one over the age. Well, I'm sure we'll get to it on some other film at some point as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting subject. I like what you're saying historically about, especially like the flapper, right? The flapper was so iconic. And then, that goes forward into like Twiggy, who, would be banned today, but at the same time, like, you had that was pretty much contemporary with Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn Monroe couldn't get a job today. I mean, she'd be seen as a plus size, So, yeah, these things have changed. With Frankenfurter, like that shift, I think you make a great point. Some people have said that, when I was in high school, we would have said Frankenfurter was bisexual. He goes for both. Obviously now we have a broader understanding of gender. We don't force people into identifying as male or female. And so Frank is now kind of seen as pansexual, that, he goes and, if you've known people who are pansexual, this is kind of true. Like he goes for, like, he can see what's beautiful about Columbia, right? He can see what's beautiful about Eddie. He wanted to shift to the Charles Atlas type, but he can get into Brad. He sees there's something beautiful about Brad. He sees there's something beautiful about Janet, and that's also kind of sexy about him. That's also kind of beautiful about and liberated.
Oh, he's totally accepting. He's totally accepting. The only time he gets angry about it is when he feels his authority is being usurped a bit, when Janet sleeps with Rocky. Other than that, he seems complete. Because if you look at the other thing as well, as say, is if you look at all of his dancers and cult members, like, they are all of different body shapes and sizes. There's a small person, there's plus size people, there are sort of like skinny people, there are tall people, like, it's a complete mishmash. Like they do not look like a bunch of Madonna's backup dancers. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? They're not, like, they are different people, and that's
Robert Palmer.
And that's cool as well. And there's a dancer in this, and I need to find the guy's name. There's a dancer in this, and I recognize him from British sitcoms. I know him mostly from a sitcom called Porridge, which is about prison life from the 70s, and he plays a character called Lukewarm, who's a gay character in that and stuff. But like seeing him, I'm like, oh, he's cool. I know him. Like, but that was really cool. The dancers were all of different body shapes and different sizes. So you're right. It just sort of, that one character of Rocky was interesting. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, actually, that's one instance of what Frankenfurter wanted, and there were so many others. So it probably is it's not as problematic as I actually think it could. I originally thought it was.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you're right, especially about body type. That like, everybody is complimenting everybody else's attractiveness, right? Nobody says, Eddie is a fat dude. Nobody says that. It's just like everybody gets why you go for Eddie. When they're stripping Brad is not, the muscular type. He's not overweight, especially, but he's not, Charles Atlas. And they say slowly, it's too nice a job to rush. They're constantly making these "I find you attractive" comments to each other, including about people who don't fit. The one thing that I would say when you were talking about that crowd is, I think they're all white.
Yes. No, there isn't. There is a black guy in there, And I recognised him again. There was a reason why. He might be stood up. He might have stood up because he was the only sort of black character in there. But no, he stood out for a reason, and I think it was his basically his facial hair and his hairstyles. Like, you look cool now. Like, if you were to go out in the street now in 2020, like, you'd look ace. Like, that was what I was thinking. Like, because some of the characters in this, like you say, look timeless. Like some of the costumes and stuff, like, you could do this as an act now, and it would look cool. And I think he's one of the characters. I was like, you just look cool in that suit. But no, there is a black individual in there. But there's a short person, and there's someone who for some reason looks like what's the pop artist called?
Andy Warhol.
Andy Warhol. There's one who looks like Andy Warhol. Yeah. I'm like, different. Like a buffet of different types of people, which is cool.
Well, this was kind of like Andy Warhol's factory, right? I mean, the reports of how crazy it was and a total cult of personality.
Yes, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah. One of the things, the other thing I sort of, as a fun, I'll ask you your final thoughts in a moment. But one of the things that sort of struck me on this was you talked about pleasure and you mentioned about pain as well. I mean, you talked about more psychological pain, but and I obviously weirdly bring this back to horror again because it is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. But when I sort of see Frankenfurter, and obviously there's that whole thing of sort of like the drag, and he's got the heels and the corset, and the next stage of this, because it's all about shock, isn't it? It's about that shock, about the sort of like what takes you to that next stage. Weirdly, I went to the Cenobites of Hellraiser, and a comment that Clive Barker made. I read when is that 2012, around that period, and then an interview with him about sort of like the Cenobites and sort of saying that, do you think they would still play today? And he was like, well, the thing was, and because he referenced it, he references Rocky Horror. He says, well, in the 70s, Rocky Horror was shocking. In 75 when it came out, people were like, oh my God, sort of like, this sort of thing. And then he says, throughout the 80s, it got, there was the excess of the early 80s and stuff, and sort of the explosion of sort of potentially sort of the part of the gay scene and the all these other things. So when it came to him creating the Cenobites, he was like, no, I had to really sort of like shock people with like the body thing of like pain and pleasure and that sort of thing. And he was like, but at this time, so I'll say by 2012, 2013, I think he was like, even that's not shocking now, because the thing of like people, hanging themselves up with extreme body piercings and extreme body modification, and it all goes into this thing of sort of pleasure and pain and expressing yourself. That's the norm. That they are not like niche subcultures anymore. Like, people are covered in tattoos, people are covered in piercings, and it goes to the next level. And it's sort of like, it's an evolution of expression, isn't it? So yeah, I wear high heels and stockings. I look fabulous. Up to, tattoos, piercings, punk rock hairstyles, and so on and so forth. So it did make me think about the evolution of self-expression in more and more extreme ways. And I'm very squeamish, so that I have got tattoos, but the thought of piercings kind of scares me. But yeah, I don't know. It just made me think about that sort of thing of the self-expression in different ways through some sort of external way for people to recognize it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel strange about that because I feel like, I mean, first of all, I don't have tattoos or piercings. I'm kind of like, Brad's like, certainly not. He's asked, do you have any tattoos? Yeah, I'm sort of like, there are tattoos I think look good, but mostly I think like, I don't want to commit to that. That scares me. And I've resisted the piercings and stuff. So, I mean, in some ways I'm sort of straight laced, but in others I, am not. But I do think that, for me, I mean, you were talking about the Cenobites and sort of how society has progressed. I mean, I do think that we're not, in my experience, we're not as far along as what you were describing. I had a friend who visited me from out of state probably 5 years ago. And we were in a parking lot, and he spontaneously kissed me in the parking lot. People drove by and honked their horns and screamed and screamed gay slurs at us
Right.
on the spot.
Yeah.
And I know that I know people who dress in ways that are not gender conforming, who are scared of being murdered. The reality is we have a trans murder spree going on, and that's going on in the U.S., and I shudder to think of what it's like in a lot of developing countries.
Mm.
My experience is that, people can talk about BDSM, but it's still scary for a lot of people. Certainly the tattoo culture has changed, the piercing culture has changed, the dress is more acceptable, but I still think this is an important message. I was thinking about there's this wonderful bit when Frank is doing the floor show and he's just been revealed with an RKO thing. And I have the soundtrack on, all my devices, right? So there's this bit where, he's talking, he says, whatever happened to Faye, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, he's talking about her dress. And he says, as it clung to her thigh, how I started to cry because I wanted to be dressed just the same.
Mm-hmm.
And it's transcendent and beautiful. And, I've dressed in drag. I enjoy it. It's something I've done maybe twice in the last 20 years, but I think it's cool. I think that is such a beautiful sentiment.
Mm.
Just, as a kid, realizing, how many kids realize that, now we know that people often realize that they're gay or that they're trans in childhood, and it stays for their whole life. How many kids had that experience and just, recognize that and could say, my God, that's me. That's beautiful. I'm going to be that. And I am filled with so much love and compassion, and my heart move when Frank sings that. And I feel as if if I want to dress up in drag, that's great. If I want to be gay, that's great. And that freedom that he's talking about, that experience gives me the freedom to do those things if I decide tomorrow I want to do them, but also to, like fashion, to, let myself, if I want to collect My Little Pony, collect My Little Pony. I mean, if I like kind of some cute stuff, that's like cute Japanese little trinkets, it's okay. The world's I'm not going to go to hell because I'm not manly enough or something. So for me, that message, that be it, don't dream it. And that message, however flawed in this film, is still one I need to hear. And it's one that certainly the society that I live in needs to hear. And, as far as we've come, we both know that there are forces trying to drag us backwards. And I think they have to be opposed as strongly as humanly possible.
No, you are right. And in maybe sort of like, say, you and I travel in circles that are probably more accepting than the vast majority of things. And we're lucky to have those friends and relationships where, like you say, it's something I sort of try and instill in Ellie. She's 7, and so you get those questions. We have a trans woman sort of living over the street from us, and I wouldn't say she's shunned, but she's clearly very uncomfortable about doing things outside the house and stuff, and she seems to be getting more confident stuff. But there was a lot of time not long ago, sort of, where Ellie was walked past and would be like, she said to me, "Is that a woman?" And the simple answer was like, "Yes." And then you've got to fulfill that with, like, well, I can't just leave it at that. And so then we had that conversation of like, well, some people, there's degrees. Like you identify yourself as a little girl right now, but in some point in life you may feel differently. And there are people that feel differently now and want to do things differently. And like, you have to have those conversations. But I think it's great that I can have those conversations, and the world is now having those conversations. And if anything, I feel sorry for those people that can't have those conversations for whatever reason. They have got some restraints or constraints around their life. Because you're right, it should be beautiful that you can say. It's funny because I dress very conventionally. I'm quite comfortable in a pair of t-shirt and a pair of jogging bottoms. You know, it's like I'm not fabulous in any real way in that sense. I'm very conventional, and in many ways, I've always been quite jealous of those people that can. Like, I always look at people and go, like, dude, you look awesome. You know, like, but then other people have said to me, like, yeah, but you did wrestling. You went out in front of a group of people in Lycra, and you go, and you sort of go, yeah, you're right, I did. And if anything, I would do it again at the drop of a hat. And so you do realize that actually, yeah, do you know what? We've all got these things that we love and enjoy and make us feel great. And so, do you know what? We should celebrate that in any way we can. And I think you're right that this film does that. And I think that's you know, for all the points, that we've said about, you know, good or bad about some of the characterizations and some of the problems with it aging, this does have a really positive message overall, and it should be celebrated. So that is what I do thoroughly enjoy about this film. I've just realized we're sort of running vastly quickly out of time, so I'm going to ask final thoughts on Rocky Horror Picture Show. What are your final thoughts? Just a final sentiment from me then, Julian. What are your final thoughts?
I miss that we're under COVID and I can't wear colorful jackets. That's my, expression. Yeah, I mean, I think we've said it all. I think, be it, don't dream it. If you haven't seen this, see it. For all of its flaws, it is a beautiful and wonderful film that has, touched a lot of people and given a lot of people courage to love themselves and love each other. And for a musical that's also fun and, wonderful. How amazing is that?
I agree. I mean, this film works on so many levels. Like I say, it's a real positive message. It's just plain fun. Like, the performances in this are brilliant. Tim Curry is just perfection in this film. Like, there's no other, as you say, this and Clue are why I love him. I think he is fantastic. And so I'm really, but more than that, like, it's got a kick-ass soundtrack. The message is positive. It's just fun. If you can get this, you can get this in many, many different ways. I'm sure you can stream it. There's DVD, Blu-ray. But more than that, I regret now that I haven't done it, and I'm going to do it. As soon as we get the opportunity, whether it be in a drive-in or whatever we're going to do, see this with people. See it in a group, because this film is one of those films that should be celebrated as a group. And wear whatever the hell you want when you do it, to be perfectly honest. So, on that note, I think we've said it all. I've really enjoyed this one as well, because it's been a quality one. And I'm glad we paired it with Barbarella as well. I think that was a really cool little combination of two camp classics. But yeah, we're following this up now. We're getting into the 80s, and things start to take a dark twist, as they sort of did in the 80s, to be perfectly honest. We're back with Cronenberg. We did The Fly. Now we're going to be doing Videodrome next week, and we're going to be questioning our reality. So really looking forward to that, because this film gets incredibly twisted. So that's going to be a good one. If you want to get in contact with us, find us on Pod Time Space at Twitter. What do you think of this? How have you? In fact, if you've done any kind of cosplay or anything to do with this, and you've got photos, share them with us. I would love to see how people have gone to these events and taken photos. Share them with us. Get them out so we can see them. That'd be great. Julian, it's been fantastic. Thank you as always. And
thanks, Scott.
We shall see you all next week. Yes.